I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. Paul wrote that in Galatians 2:20. And so while we're talking about why the cross still matters, we've established that Jesus Christ died as our substitute, redeeming us from the penalty of sin. Sadly, that's where many believers stop. Today, the Apostle Paul reveals the importance of our identification with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's what Paul meant when he wrote, I have been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ that lives in me. You see, Paul realized that this old sinful self was nailed to that cross. As followers of Jesus, we need the same realization. Although we weren't there 2,000 years ago, we died and were buried with Christ through faith. Romans 6 tells us about this reality over and over again. We died to sin in verse 2. We have been baptized into his death in verse 3. Buried into his death in verse 4. United with him in the likeness of his death in verse 5. And our old self was crucified with him in verse 6 of Romans 6. You see, Jesus himself instructed believers to live each day in this reality. In Luke 9:23, he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Denying self means yielding your personal desires and agenda to God's will. Identification with the death of Christ is essential to authentic discipleship. German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it this way, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. You see, uniting with Jesus in death means we can also identify with his life. That's why Romans 6:11 tells us that we are alive to God in Christ Jesus. By agreeing with God that our old self is dead and buried with Christ, we can enjoy the victory of his resurrection in everyday life. Will you consider the death of Jesus on the cross as your death to self? Or were you still living by your own agenda? When you yield those desires completely to the risen Lord, you will have the identifying marks of his disciples: submission, service, and sacrifice. That's why the cross still matters.